Okay, everyone, this week we are talking about Mesoamerica. First off, the term Mesoamerica is referring to Middle America. Meso is middle, and it's middle from the perspective of the hemisphere between North and South America, essentially. The cultural region of ancient Mesoamerica consists mainly of modern day Mexico, especially central Mexico and southern Mexico. When you get into northern Mexico, it's a little bit of a different ballgame, as well as West Mexico. Both of those have kind of their own thing going on. They were perceived such by the Aztecs, for example, as being a place of barbarians. It's a harsher desert climate, particularly in the north, and just different kind of people could live there. As well as Central America. So basically Central Mexico and Southern Mexico and Central America. Here's our map. One brief comment on geography. It's a geography of extremes. You have flat tropical lowlands with dense rainforest. You have coastline. You have sections of desert. And you have very high mountains. This is also an area where hurricanes are a common problem, or the traditional thing that happens, as well as volcanoes. So you have volcanoes, you've got hurricanes, you've got extremes of different type of topography and local ecology, and so. It's something that likely influences their perceptions of the natural world and of religion. The word hurricane, for example, is rooted in a Maya word for hurricanes. Just one more connection there. This map is going to show you some of the general cultural regions. So in North America, we looked at the different culture. They're called culture regions. The eastern woodlands, the American Southwest, the Great Plains, the Pacific Northwest, California is usually treated on its own, the Plateau region, the Arctic and subarctic, which we didn't cover. But those are different cultural regions where people had a similar lifestyle and set of kind of cultural practices, often related languages. In Mesoamerica, this is our map of cultural regions. The thing with Mesoamerica that's very different than North America is just the population size. This part of the world in Mesoamerica was highly populated. It was one of the more dense parts of the world in terms of population. And people were moving around a lot, including in very ancient times. And so some of the boundaries are not 100% clear. You likely have Maya people who are indicated in green. You likely have some of them who actually are living far away in places like Tenochtitlan later on, and Teotihuacan, even in the classic period during kind of the Maya classic Maya heyday, because people traveled around for business, trading, because they wanted to. It looks like Teotihuacan, for example, is a city we'll talk about, had ethnic neighborhoods, which is something you see in, modern day America and in cities, all over. People tend to cluster around an ethnic group that where they feel, have friends or relatives, and I don't know, where you feel familiar and everybody knows your name or whatever. So it's something you see in Teotihuacan and later in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. All right, so note the Olmec, as we'll talk about them in a second. It's a much smaller region, mainly rainforest and some mountain area, mostly forest though. And basically, the Olmec, like other Mesoamericans in their area, would be basically forest farmers, as many people in this part of the world still are forest farmers today. And their main crop was corn, I have been actually lecturing a good bit today, and I'm starting to, you start to get to that point later in the day where like, wait a minute, have I already said this? Anyway, corn. Corn is the main crop. It's actually developed in Mesoamerica. And I like this slide because it shows the development from a grass. You think of how human beings changed grass into a very, nutritious, tasty, ear of corn. It has really giant seeds, that we eat. And it's a really huge change, more than the other cereal crops. And so it just shows the kind of extent of native or indigenous, manipulation of this important food crop that's widely eaten today in the United States and the Americas and China and Africa and elsewhere. Italy. All right, the Olmec people are classically in Mesoamerican studies seen as the mother culture. The idea of the Olmec is, and what that means is that the other Mesoamerican societies are culturally derived from them. Probably not like as an ethnic group, but more so culturally heavily influenced by the Olmec. They seem to have originated a lot of distinctive Mesoamerican cultural practices, including things like large-scale mound building, which was already going on in North America in this time, actually. North America was actually earlier than Mesoamerica on that. But Olmec seem to have been kind of getting that game going. They seem to have been the first to use jade significantly for artworks. Jade is a blue-green semi-precious stone. Technically what they have in this region is jadeite, which to my understanding is a little bit different than pure jade, but basically to me it looks the same, and to them it was the most prized luxury material. This green-blue rock had to be imported in from the mines where it's quarried out, and that seems to be something they originated, and it becomes a distinctive feature of Mesoamerican culture, like Maya, Teotihuacan, Aztec, and others that we don't have time to cover, all have prized jade as something of, something like gold, basically, for maybe modern America. Were they really the mother civilization? A lot of scholars think the Maya were actually developing independently. We have a lot more archaeology since the mother civilization thesis developed. And so, yes and no, right? It's kind of more complex than like, everything just started at the Olmec. That'd be cool, but it probably wasn't. The person who developed that thesis, by the way, is very famous. Miguel Covarrubias was a Mexican artist and writer, very famous figure in history of the Americas. And he was very fascinated with studying early civilizations in Mesoamerica, and he was the first to categorize a lot of the styles of Mesoamerican art. And he believed analyzing the styles of art, which is something you do in kind of more advanced art history, he was able to trace the different symbolism of figures like Tlaloc, who's a rain god of the Aztec, back to jaguar deities and or at least jaguar imagery in Olmec art. That's another thing to note. I don't put that really on here, but the jaguar is the apex predator of this part of the world. And jaguars feature commonly as a reference point in Mesoamerican art and culture. I have a lot of other things on here. I'm trying to keep this lecture a little bit shorter because I recorded an undergrad one a while back earlier today that was ended up going like an hour and a half. So I don't really want that to happen again. And we actually have a lot of really high quality smart history videos where they actually go to museums and look at these objects in person and record that in very good video. And so I think lecture has its uses, but for art, like, it's really great to be able to see that like up close, like good camera work, visuals of the image of the artworks. There's really nothing that quite compares to that. I'll note a couple more things. Urbanization in this model of the Olmec resembles what we saw in North America. Not Cahokia. actually more like Hopewell people, in the sense that they built ceremonial centers, complex ceremonial centers, but most people lived dispersed out, farming and hunting still. At no point in the Americas did people stop hunting. I don't know of anywhere that was really a thing. I mean, probably a lot of the urban men didn't commonly hunt, but they likely had, and it wasn't something that went away. Because a lot of us are more familiar with old world histories where they had stock they were raising, livestock, and there wasn't much need to hunt anymore. And in fact, the two things actually kind of conflicted with each other in the old world, because you can kind of either have a forest with a bunch of deer in it, or you can have cows running in the forest. Like, they kind of compete with each other ecologically. And so, like, a lot of the old world, they just kind of killed all the old wild animals and just replaced them with compliant, manageable livestock like cows and sheep and goats and all that. But there wasn't anything like that in the Americas, and so hunting remains a common reference point here, especially for common people living connected to these urban sites, but living out mainly in more dispersed settlements that were likely people who were related to each other, living close to each other, as during the Hopewell times in eastern North America. One of the cultural main features of Mesoamerica that united all these people was a love of a sport. We just call it the ball game. And I always think of it as a forerunner to soccer, which is maybe a little misleading, but nowadays people in this part of the world love soccer. And the idea of hitting a rubber ball up and down a field is like similar to the Mesoamerican ball game. They invented rubber balls. Rubber comes from trees in this area, but their rubber balls were small and hard and dense. They weren't hollow and full of air like our modern balls. Theirs were solid. I actually have never held a solid rubber ball, but I picture it to be something kind of like the balls they use for handball. Like in New York, I believe people play handball. But these balls are supposed to be really heavy, and when they're flying hard, evidently they were heavy enough that they could cause break bones and stuff. Like, they're really hard and heavy and dense. And so men competed in the ball game. We don't know of any women competing. Probably someone did here and there, but generally it was men who competed. They wear helmets, kind of like a old time football helmet, and padding too. I don't have that on my slide, but they would wear. The rules of the ball game were you're supposed to hit the ball with your hip. I mean, that's kind of like the classic way. And so they would sometimes wear body armor there, which you see depicted to make that a little easier to do. These games would be big events. And they're depicted in the Maya creation story, which likely has some features in common with older stories, perhaps those of the Olmec, which unfortunately do not survive. But the Maya one, the Popol Vuh it's called, survives, and you can read it in modern translations. The most well-known story from the Americas literature. And in the Popol Vuh, you have the two main characters are called the Hero Twins, and they end up playing this ball game against the Lord of the Dead, basically Lord of Xibalba, like the underworld. And so it's this big epic ball game. And so it has a really important cultural place. And ball games happen ceremonially, and they were also just played for fun in Mesoamerica. Sacrifice, you can't avoid talking about that. So nowadays, we often think human sacrifice as more the Aztec model, where at times during the Flower Wars, which we'll talk about later, it looks like maybe hundreds or thousands of men were sacrificed, killed ceremonially. That doesn't seem to have been common before, particularly during the Olmec and Maya times. But concepts of sacrifice, including some degree of human sacrifice, existed. But the way to think about sacrifice, the most common type of sacrifice is a kind of self-sacrifice, where commonly in Mesoamerica, people would pierce their tongue and drip that blood out, and the blood is given in like a ceremonial little vessel or bowl that is for the gods. And sometimes men, particularly elite men, would perforate perforate their penises. I'm actually not really sure how that works. And the blood from that man part would have they thought, a certain kind of vital force that the gods particularly wanted. And the way I think of it is they believe in this kind of idea of a cycle of life where, our lives depend on death, right? Plants die, animals die to sustain us. And in a lot of ways, our lives are based on the fact previous people have died. We would kind of replace them on the earth. They're fascinated with that. And they believe that they look at life almost as like a finite quantity, that if you're taking, you have to kind of give back, or else bad things happen. And so this kind of logic of reciprocity, or sort of cycle of life, death comes from life, life comes from death idea is a fundamental concern of Mesoamerican people. This is why the idea of needing to sacrifice your own blood is kind of part of it, as part of their religion. This can seem a little weird for modern people. But I think of a lot of Christian paintings I've seen where there's a fair amount of blood depicted. And the whole idea of sacrifice is really fundamental to that religion. The belief that Jesus needs to sacrifice, or else, bad stuff's going to happen to you. I mean, this is really not that much different than, obviously it's different in a lot of ways, but there's some similar idea of reciprocity, I think behind these religions. Now, the Aztec model we'll look at, they're a little bit different. Aztec we're all familiar with this history. The Aztecs believed in a kind of end time scenario where it's basically like preordained that there's a kind of ending of the world, right? Basically. And that's where the need to capture a lot of war captives and sacrifice them made sense. Whereas previous societies, like Olmec, they weren't really going out and fighting wars for reasons of sacrifice. Most sacrifice was done in that self-sacrifice way. But yeah, there are likely some people who were sacrificed. But here's another thing with this particular area that Olmec lived in. The soil is very volcanic, and it's full of acid, and so we don't have like barrels of the Olmec. That's actually a real issue for a couple of reasons. It's hard to see exactly who they were, who exactly their direct descendants later on. Some questions that they seem to reference in some of their artwork that they shape skulls, it's called cranial deformation, but we can't actually dig up any of their remains to see if they actually did that. So cranial deformation is when you take a baby when their head is soft and purposely shape it into a different shape than it would be naturally. And people all around the world did this in ancient times. They purposely shaped babies' heads to look more beautiful, to look like members of their ethnic group. Usually people would try to distinguish themselves visually. And so if you shape the baby's head by elongating it, which it looks like is what the Olmec did, is kind of flatten out the sides a little bit and kind of push the top up. It was a little weird to us, but people have done this around the world. And it'd be cool to be able to dig up one of the skulls, but they're unfortunately all gone. So that's just one example of the soils, and where some of the reason I bring this up is we don't find what you find at Cahokia or Aztec sites where you can actually find the remains of the people who were sacrificed. Unfortunately, anything like that wouldn't last in the Olmec homeland. All right, La Venta, they're really big, three big sites here, right? You've got La Venta, you've got Tres Zapotes, and you got San Lorenzo. Those are the three big Olmec sites. These were ceremonial cities with people dispersed out living around them. They're characterized by large platform mounds, huge, that until fairly recently had been lost to the rainforest. They were covered in trees. You can kind of get that sense here that maybe they've been recovered a little bit. So we don't really know. I mean, they had buildings on them. To give you a sense of another view of them in the rainforest. Why did they build mounds? This is your $1 million question. Why do all these people build mounds, and why this particular type of mound? It's not a barrel mound. It's a platform mound. It's kind of like Cahokia. It's kind of like some of the mounds at Poverty Point and Mississippian mounds, and like later buildings built by the Maya and Aztec and Teotihuacan, which had a similar shape but were made of stone. Why'd they do this? Many scholars think there are references to something called Sustenance Mountain in Mesoamerica, which is I believe it comes from Maya tradition, but the idea that life originated in this mountain, this kind of like symbolizes a source of life. There are references to that in Olmec art, most likely. I say most likely because we don't have like Olmec writing that explains what their art was about. It's more like trying to interpret it from the symbolism with nothing else to go by. I mean, there's like very limited glyphs from Olmec people, like their writing, but mostly it's destroyed. So we have to go off like visual comparison to later people, like more modern Maya or modern Central Mexicans. So there's a lot of uncertainties. And, adding to the uncertainty of the famous colossal heads, when these were discovered in the jungle in the mid-1800s, or as it was later in the 1800s, I'm getting my dates mixed up, but they were found by a farmer or peasant, as they're often called, in this part of southern Mexico. And that man assumed this giant head represented a black person, and was fascinated with it, and eventually these were studied and recovered from the jungle. And folks have long since that time. There's actually about, I think, 50 of these heads. There's a number of them, and they're gigantic. And the stone they were made from is not a local stone. It had to be transported with a lot of labor, miles and miles, and they're huge by pre-modern standards. I mean, they don't have oxen or anything to move these. So a lot of work, a lot of deliberation, and they all have a similar look. I've got some other ones here. They're wearing a helmet, probably a ball game helmet, perhaps for war as well. Probably a ball game helmet. They're obviously all male. They all have a sort of severe look to their face with a downward turn of the mouth that's sometimes described as a snarl. Because we see also in Olmec art, we'll see in a bit, the prevalence of jaguar imagery, references to jaguar snarling. And it's thought maybe the mouth has a reference to that kind of art. Or else it's just a man who's severe. Not sure. I think the reason the black people comparison thing was made was the nose and the sort of wider wings of the nose, and that's more roundish alar cartilage. Thinking back to my head drawing classes here. Gives that more kind of characteristically African look. Of course, some Mexican scholars point out that people in this area don't all look the same, the indigenous people. Even if you look on like an Ancestry.com, it points out some of the different subpopulations of indigenous Americans. And I think that's something that's really lost in how we talk about the Americas, because you always get this impression kind of as like just one group of people. But people, indigenous people came to this place likely in different groups, like we talked about that, thousands of years apart. And so they kind of evolved slightly under different conditions, basically, and have some different phenotypes. So anyway, no one's entirely sure what inspired these. I can certainly see why the simple farmer who uncovered them thought that it was just some kind of black person. some of my students in class were talking about the possibility of going across the Atlantic between Yucatan and West Africa, and that's definitely a feasible thing. I mean, it's not like pre-modern people couldn't do that. We have seafaring from all over the world in pre-modern times. It's a matter of hitting the current right. There have been experimental archaeologists who did. There's one really famous guy who, I think he might have gone from like Australia to South America because he wanted to prove it could be done on like a simple raft. Maybe I'll look that up in some time if anyone's interested. I read about it years ago. It's called experimental archaeology, where you kind of recreate old technologies, kind of see what can be done with it. And the bottom line is people can travel pretty far if they wanted to. The only thing is that you don't have like seafaring history in West Africa that we know of. Egypt, there's some seafaring history around the Mediterranean a little bit, but that wasn't really their thing. I mean, they weren't in a position to want to go set up empires. I mean, generally states don't go set up empires for no reason. One could argue the Spanish arrived in America almost by accident. It wasn't right. It was more about getting to the Indies around without having to deal with without having to deal with the Middle East, Near East. But anyway, something to think about. Definitely is an interesting area. One actually other theory that was put forth was the Phoenicians, who were famous seafarers and who evidently had Africans in their crew in North Africa. So that's potentially a source of inspiration. But unfortunately, with the soil in this area, you're not going to be digging anyone up to know who was there. So it's for folks on Reddit to argue over. There's a really cool statues, probably more naturalistic, more realistic. They seem individualized, and it's not just a generic type. They're different than probably anything we saw in North America. So if we kind of flash back and forth between this and this, one thing I see in common is almond eyes and a snarling mouth, downturned mouth. What this is we call it a celt or axe head. It wasn't actually used to chop anything. It's made out of jade, which is not very hard. It's a ceremonial object. It's Olmec. And what it depicts is one of the premier Olmec symbols, which is one of the most amusing, I think, from world art history, which is it's called a were-jaguar baby, like a werewolf, but a were-jaguar, where a person is changing into a jaguar and has like a combination of human and jaguar features. This combination is something we see as a reference really in all the art of the Mesoamerica, and somewhat in other aspects of their culture, like shamanism. So this little axe head fits in your hand. It's not very big. It depicts in the lower half a little baby's body wrapped up in like swaddling cloth, with hands clasping something, but we can't see what it's holding. There are many of these, and they all have that kind of body and hand posture. So it's like a little baby with its hands right there holding something. And then we go to the much bigger in scale, bigger in proportion head, which seems to have been cranially deformed. The sides of the skull or cranium there, you see they're flattened out and stretched up. We see that in a number of Olmec artworks. We see these almond eyes, like that scholars and they often consult with local people in this area too to try to like kind of get more indigenous people's take on them, these ancient artifacts, and they're perceived as being jaguar eyes. And then this odd kind of snarling mouth, as well as this like pug nose kind of. You see like the little nostrils kind of, and they're like facing us. And then the mouth is this snarl. And the way the mouth is made involved a hand drill And so they drilled out like the corners of the mouth. And then it has fangs coming down too. So a lot of labor went into this. My understanding is like, if you have a flint hand drill and then try to drill in the stone, it's going to take you a while. Like a long time, like maybe a week of just drilling into this. It's a lot of time and effort to make it like this. So we know these are really special objects. No one knows exactly who in Olmec society owned them. Were they rulers? Were they shamans? Were they just regular people who somehow got a hold of these? A lot of us think shamans, because one of the features of shamanism in Mesoamerica, I guess I haven't mentioned this in class before, but shamans in Mesoamerica have been perceived as people who are able to use spiritual powers to heal or to actually leave their body in a normal sense and go into a spirit world, influence animals and plants and spirits to do good things or potentially evil things, because some people are afraid of shamans too, traditionally, can do bad things as well, and come back. And in this journey, they call it the shaman's journey, they will often be accompanied by an animal companion. It can be any animal, but it's frequently a jaguar, kind of like a spiritual version of a jaguar that can go with them. People think shamans can sometimes communicate with jaguars, an animal they're generally afraid of, and basically have this connection. And so this idea of transformation, an idea of connection, transformation in particular being tied to jaguars, could have a shamanic reference. Or a different possibility is that, like some other later Mesoamerican art, this is actually maybe a character from a story that at the time people would have known, oh, well, that's the young so-and-so when they were a were-jaguar baby. But we don't know, unfortunately, because we don't have any of their writing telling us their stories, and this was thousands of years ago. But we often are studying this kind of thing by comparison to the Maya, where we know a lot, and to the Aztec, where we know a lot, and other smaller Mesoamerican people, as well as indigenous peoples of further south into South America, can be useful comparisons as well. All right, so we see a similar type to these Celts. Some people think some of the features are inspired by toads as well. They, like other indigenous Americans, were aware that some plants and amphibians have a chemical within them that can cause hallucinations in people. And this was used by shamans and sometimes by regular people as part of an aid on their spiritual journey, basically, to have kind of spiritual consciousness. In parts of Mexico, that's magic mushrooms, what we call magic mushrooms, like psilocybin mushrooms. You have, in South America, tea that's made out of two different plants prepared called ayahuasca that's used for that. You have, originating in North Mexico and then coming into the United States, peyote. It's like it's a cactus. But there's a bunch of other plants too. Morning glory seeds, a lot that were used. The actual extent of knowledge of plants is one of the most impressive things about the indigenous Americas and a lot of traditional cultures. And they really knew what was around them. The Olmec, likely based on what later people did and by the references in the art, were likely extracting hallucinogen from a toad that had a special cultural reference point. And I don't exactly know why a toad would produce a hallucinogen, but it's something you can look into if you're interested in that kind of thing. But these were used in indigenous American religions, but also other religions as well around the world. Have a history of this kind of thing. Note the cleft in the heads of these. Right at the top, there's that little V shape. It's thought that's a reference to Sustenance Mountain, where they have this cleft said to be in the mountain where life comes from. So it's a kind of a mythic reference. It's interesting how one kind of symbolic object can reference a lot of different cultural narratives. And, I always say, look at how we take a Christian artwork, which you guys may not be super familiar with, but in art history, there are a lot of Christian artworks because the church was a huge sponsor of art for a lot of centuries. And the artworks commonly have all kinds of multiple stories referenced, a story of a saint, story of something with Mary, something with Jesus, one of the disciples. There's a lot of things going on. And it's you have to kind of know the stories to be able to know the artwork. And it's a shame we can't know these kind of objects with the same kind of degree of precision that more modern art we can know. I think these are such cool little objects. Were-jaguar babies. All right, this one's not as good a repair, but gives you a sense of what archaeology is actually like, right? I mean, don't always find things that are beautiful, like museum specimens. All right, similar to some of the gorgets that we saw in North America, you have decorative jade masks that were likely worn on the upper chest. May have been worn different ways as well. Here you have one of them. Has certain symbolic features, or we call it iconography, or symbolism, kind of writing with pictures and signs. So similar iconographic features such as the almond eyes and that snarling mouth that may be a jaguar reference. Perhaps this is a shaman's face. Shamans around the world have commonly worn masks as part of their preparation for their spiritual journey. So it could be some kind of reference to that. This one seems to have scarification, where you scratch or cut into your skin a design. Could be just tattooing it's referencing, but could also be scarification. So, every culture, I suppose, produces certain object types. We've got the were-jaguar babies, we've got the colossal heads, we've got the jade masks. These are all classic type of objects within Olmec art history. So a smaller one that was actually found on a Maya site. This shows some of the connections of people trading material culture objects, and the fact this was likely purchased or obtained by a Maya person who has scratched in Maya writing or Maya glyphs into the small pendant. So there you go. It's showing the dynamic exchange of objects, so that they aren't just created and just sat down, but actually travel around and travel across cultures and, or in fact, reinscribed with meaning by the new owners. This one suggests a baby's head, harkening back to the babies that we've seen. It also, the flattening out of the sides of the head, the bald head, bald top, and the kind of elongated top of the cranium. This is something we see in other of these sculptures. I'll flip forward to actually see if I have. It's always a little hard to predict the exact perfect order. But these are ceramics made with Olmec that seem to show this kind of baby, maybe mythic baby, maybe a mythic hero as a baby. Because we see this little guy, he's a chubby little baby, but his face is very serious. He's got his snarling mouth, maybe open speaking. And, excuse me, voice starting to go here. His hand is raised, in a position maybe oratory. It reminds me of old world depictions of kings or emperors as children. So this could be some kind of hero person, because he doesn't look like just any old baby. Note his skull. He seems to have had his head kind of deformed, flattened out on the side and stretched out. Again, this is what we're talking about when I mentioned the cranial deformation. It's thought that they may have actually done that. There's examples elsewhere in Mesoamerica of that kind of thing. As well in North America, you may have heard of a tribe out west called the Flathead. at least called so by English speakers. I'm forgetting their indigenous name. That's because they would flatten out their forehead as babies. Thought that looked better. I mean, that's nothing unusual in human history. All right. Now we have a man holding a little baby jaguar, werewolf, or not werewolf, were-jaguar. What is the deal with this? No one really knows. Like, you see this standardized type. Now we've got an adult holding this type of baby. What's it mean? Here we have a man who's emerging out of a cave in a large stone, perhaps was a altar for religious activities, like a ceremonial table. It's flat on top. It may not have been used for that, but that's one theory with this. And is holding a little baby, probably meant to be a were-jaguar baby. Two babies who look the same or about the same size and are put symmetrically on this so-called altar stone so that they mirror each other. This is thought to be a reference to twins. They look the same, they mirror each other, they're central in the composition. And the reason our mind jumps to twins is because we're familiar with Maya culture later on, where the two main heroic figures are the hero twins. And it's thought that twins, or it's actually true across a number of Mesoamerican societies, twins are celebrated and are something there's characters within myth of hero twins. There's actually examples of that in North America too. So it's possible that the hero twin stories originate in the Olmec, or at least are as old as the Olmec. It's a perforator for doing your sacrifices. So it's going to go through your tongue or penis, if you have one. So imagine that. I mean, this is a religion that's not all talk, that's for sure. I think it's helpful to think about self-sacrifice, though, or it's also called auto-sacrifice, just because the kind of European biased perspective was very much like focused on the, kind of understandably, I guess, focused on the really dramatic execution and sacrifice of war captives by the Aztec, but the more common, just general cultural practice was self-sacrifice. Okay, feathered serpent. This is yet another example of why Covarrubias thought the Olmec were a mother culture. Feathered serpents, like a combination of a snake with feathers, like of an eagle perhaps, or more commonly a quetzal bird. They occur in the Aztec and Maya cultures as well, and they may be depicted here with the Olmec. And so it's suggesting this kind of common ground of all the Mesoamerican figures. Later Aztecs called this spiritual being the Quetzalcoatl, or this quetzal bird snake. This is what that name means. And he was an important culture hero. We actually see similar combinations of snakes with wings in North America too. And so that's an example of how, why is it these different far-flung places have some similar mythic beings? Is it just that they had the same cultural roots as animists and shamanists? Or is it they had some kind of cultural exchange via traveling? No one can really prove that one way or the other. All right, little hero baby with his ball player helmet on. Yeah, just so intriguing. I mean, who was this person? What was this, some kind of mythic hero from the stories? If you're familiar with old world art at all, we have a lot of little statues of the baby Hercules, the beloved cultural hero story, main character in a bunch of stories in ancient Rome and Greece. Later, little heroic statues or paintings of Jesus became common, little baby Jesus. Those were actually based off, in some cases, were based off the baby Hercules. And so it makes you think of other examples like that, of these like culture heroes shown as babies. Back to him. And then there are some reliefs of rulers, like in this case. And I mention that because when we get into Maya art, that's like the main thing. The Maya like their pomp and circumstance associated with with lords, with aristocratic rulers or kings. Okay, so Olmec. We want to know, are they mother culture for Mesoamerica? We want to identify the common types of symbolism and think about those, recognize them in the objects. We want to be able to think of parallels between Olmec, Maya, the Aztec as a Tenochtitlan, and the earlier city-state in central Mexico called Teotihuacan. They have a lot of things in common, but also significant differences. They're totally different peoples. But they're all Mesoamericans and have this kind of cultural horizon in common. And so we want to be able to start thinking of those similarities. All right, next door to your Olmecs, and really rising into prominence after the Olmec period, are the Maya people. One nomenclature thing to clarify, the term is actually Maya for the ethnic group and Mayan for the language group. It's like the closest comparison I can think of is Roman for the ethnic group called the Romans, and Romance for the languages that are derived from the Roman language, which was Latin, And so Mayas are the people, Mayan is the language group. I know everyone messes that up, but in the business, that's kind of how how you use it. Okay, many people are still Maya today, by the way. Olmec are unfortunately extinct people, but Mayan people are in number in the millions and are the major group in Guatemala, where Quiche Maya is still a widely spoken language. Just a couple semesters ago, I had a girl in class who was Quiche Maya speaker as her first language from Guatemala. In fact, these languages are actually become very common in United States today, particularly in Los Angeles and New York, as a lot of people, young men in particular, have left the Mayan homeland to work in the United States. Getting back to here, the people aren't all the same Maya either. You have numerous Mayan languages that are related but not at all the same language. They were written languages traditionally, but actually being able to write them in glyphs is not practiced today. Unfortunately, that writing actually didn't die out. It was only fairly recently that scholars at University of Texas, Austin, cracked the Mayan code to be able to decipher the glyphs. So you have these different languages and people living somewhat different lifestyles. You have lowland people and highland people, sort of mountain people, and then flatlands people. And the flatlands is basically tropical rainforest. And those differences, if you get into advanced Maya studies, that becomes really important, the sort of differences between all the different Maya groups. But in this class, we're just doing a little fairly brief overview here, right? So just something to know. Unlike the Olmec and unlike most of North America, masonry or stonework was really important for the Maya. They built with stone. In North America, you don't see that as much, except in cases in the Southwest, as at Chaco Canyon, where you have the old Pueblo great houses, they're called. Big works of masonry. Mostly people in North America worked with more temporary materials like wood for building. So stone. The fact they're going to all the trouble of stone suggests, makes us want to try to figure out why did they really care that much about what they're making? My opinion actually relates to the fact that they're building for the ages. It's more of a almost religious type of building. As we'll see, they aren't like building apartment buildings or something. Most Maya people lived in a hut, as some Maya people still do today. But the stonework is public buildings, temples, elite residences, not like average folks housing or something. Like the Olmec, they were corn farmers and still largely grow corn where they live. They also grew cacao beans, cocoa or chocolate, and this became like money. The beans were traded as currency by the Maya, which I can understand because chocolate is pretty delicious, and it's a stimulant. And in a world of hardship, which is definitely the Maya world, and everyone else really in the world at this point in history, stimulants are a good thing to have and to keep people going and make them feel good. And so they would consume cacao as much as they could, but unfortunately it's pretty expensive for them. And so it was mainly an elite drink. It was typically consumed as a drink, as it still commonly is in Guatemala and elsewhere in the Maya homeland. I actually have a student I mentioned who actually gave me some of that cacao for drinking. Their preference for drinking it was very bitter. It was not a sweetened drink. It was not like a Hershey's chocolate bar. It wasn't like hot cocoa either. It's a bitter drink that I can only compare to whiskey. It's very strong. A little goes a long way, and it's an acquired taste. There's a place, there are actually numerous businesses now around that you can order Mesoamerican style cacao drinks. I think the only one I've ever had was in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I think it was one of the first. And they try to recreate some of the recipes for cacao that involve things like, developed probably more with Aztec, but probably Maya as well, which are seasoning with things like chili peppers and flowers. And so it's a different style of cuisine for sure. Spicy, hot, bitter cacao, and a little bit of kind of aromatic flavor of flowers. A different type of flowers are used for cooking. So pretty interesting. Definitely check that out if you ever have the opportunity. If you all get interested in native culture at all, indigenous cultures, Santa Fe, New Mexico is super touristy, but it's very much set up for visiting. It's not a bad place to visit. Really not that expensive. A place to go in New Mexico. It's one of the only places I've been where indigenous people, especially if you seek it out, have kind of a prominent place in the local community, and it's some of it's really new agey and kind of superficial, but there's some good sides to it as well. Very interesting sides. Like the Olmec, they played the ball game, and we know a lot about this because of the Popol Vuh and because of their artwork. Again, the Popol Vuh is their creation story. Highly recommend checking that out if you're interested in this kind of area of study. The main characters in the Popol Vuh are the hero twins. We see them depicted in art. Tlaloc, or the rain god. I call him Tlaloc. That's the Aztec name for him. I usually just call him Tlaloc to keep things really simple for all my classes. They called him Chalk, a Maya name, but Tlaloc it's the same god. He just kind of keeps being a god in the different cultures. Because they're all farmers and they all care about the rain, just like the people like Cahokia who are intensive farmers. So rain is really important for a farming religion. We see the feathered serpent creature, spirit, like at the Olmec, and especially like in later Aztec. So we have the sacrifice idea. It's a reference point. We actually see a relief that depicts a noblewoman who's piercing her tongue. Unlike the Olmec, and really unlike anything in North America, the Maya people seem to have been more, expansionist oriented. Meaning the leadership believed it was important to have a military and to be in a position of expanding your sovereignty. And so we see a lot of warfare references with Maya. In fact, that's one of the main things as a subject matter. And so that's kind of an interesting departure. Why is it war becomes more an endemic feature of life? They have a complex, cool writing system, the Maya glyphs. It's a true language. It's not just pictographs. It can write new concepts. It can describe imaginative things that don't exist. It can do complex math. I'm going to put the number system in with the writing system. And math was of special interest to the Maya as well for the long count, which was their cycle of time. They believed like the ages of creation were divided into sections of 5,126 years. And then they also went by a 260-day short count calendar. Both of those are found across in Mesoamerica, so it wasn't just a Maya thing, but it's an important part of their culture. In terms of famous locations that you can visit if you want, I haven't visited. I like to visit the Maya city-states, but Tikal and Calakmul are two of the most famous for artworks. Palenque is a good one. A lot of people go to Palenque. Calakmul is probably the nicest murals. Tikal is a very famous city. It'd be a good one to go to. Another feature, before I move on, is the hierarchy of the Maya, very clear. They have what we translate as lords. They have basically nobles or aristocrats. They have a court life where these elites don't have jobs and they're supported by the population. And they lord over or rule over the surrounding people, who are mostly farmers, but also craftsmen and traders. And other sorts of, other sorts of specialists, artists, as well. So they have this clear social hierarchy or ranking that starts to distinguish them and suggest the later Mesoamerican people. So just a comment I put in here about the role of politics. There's this idea within anthropology called a theater state. It's the idea that a lot of pre-modern peoples, like their government really didn't have power to assert state power all over. Like they don't have much of an army really by modern standards. They don't have police. They don't have jails. They don't have a court system really. They have limited capacity to exert state power. This is not like the British Empire or something later in modern times where they actually have a massive army and navy and go around the world and will, act brutally to exert their power in India and elsewhere. So the reason we talk about this is that the theater state idea is that the way maybe they pre-modern states have maintained power is more through spectacle and drama and feeling and emotion and aesthetics of basically creating the image that your leadership is ordained by the gods, that it's more or less unquestionable, that you have an almost supernatural power to your position as a lord, and that while you may not personally send out an army to go burn down the village of people resisting you, the gods will, or something bad's going to happen. And so people believe in this kind of system and they don't really go against it. We know Maya rulers put a lot of effort into projecting power through ceremony that was about displaying their elite status, by commissioning artworks that display their power and authority, particularly Maya stela, we'll see, which are carved stones that depict the face of the king and sometimes various great things the king did, like military victories. If you're familiar again with old world art, it might suggest to you things like Roman victory columns, which would have the image of the emperor along with a bunch of kind of propaganda about the great accomplishments of the ruler. Well, Maya, they don't have this big army really to send out. I mean, they have some army, but likely they're ruled more by the ideology that people believed in and the power of the ruler to exert an impression of being powerful and almost supernaturally powerful. My art, naturally, based on all this, doesn't. It's commissioned by the elite, and it doesn't depict ordinary people, with the exception of some murals that Colloquial will look at. Mostly, it's a world of kings and the court and gods, heroes. Here we go. So Palenque, massive stone temples that are basically a translation of mound building into stone, transformed into a small urban complex. Again, in the Maya model, people didn't live in the city like as a modern, like American type city. They lived scattered out, and these cities were ceremonial centers where mainly an elite lived and ruled. So just some examples there. You can see all the tourists visiting Palenque. Palenque is known for the Temple of Inscriptions, where a very famous Maya ruler is, where he's entombed. So here we go. You can see the green. That is a jade death mask of King Pakal, or Lord Pakal, sometimes called Pakal the Great. He was one of the best or most successful of the Maya rulers, and he's remembered in later Maya history. And so he's interred there, and we find this massive stone covering of his tomb. It's a sarcophagus lid carved in relief. Relief carving is where you carve away the space around your image, and so you get like a relief or 3D projection up of the image from the background. Reliefs were made all over the world in ancient times. They're one of the main art forms. So this relief depicts sometimes called the resurrection of Pakal. It appears to be, on the right of this slide, you can see the little line drawing to make it a little bit more clear what we see. It seems to be Pakal ascending up a world tree. You get this kind of cross symbol. Pakal is thought, some scholars think he's in a position of a fetus that represents rebirth. It's probably that he was believed to have been a certain star when he was reborn. Other depictions suggest he's reborn as a tree, or his people, or his line are as trees. And showing that kind of kinship between people and nature in Mesoamerican belief. So look at this as an artwork. The way they design is full of very intense visual rhythm, a lot of repeating shapes combined in close space, almost like in a music, if you have a bunch of 16th notes all combined together. It's very kind of quick beats or quick rhythm. It's the same kind of thing. These are very visually intense, a lot of small shapes combined together quickly into a composition. It's very intense to look at, is what I'm trying to say. And it merges the figure of Pakal into this wider kind of cosmic picture of the world tree. The world tree, I should say, if you're unfamiliar with this idea, it's kind of like a tree of life idea. It's like there's a magical or spiritual tree at the middle of the universe that kind of is the center of the world. And if you're moving between realms of life and death, you're going to go up and down this tree. So it's something from Maya stories. Note his nose. By the way, this is a very famous aspect of Maya art. People will call this an aquiline nose. I'm not really sure that's the exact word for it, but it's like kind of like a bird beak. And that was considered the ideal, to have that kind of straight line going from the forehead down to the tip of the nose. And they really play that up in the art, as we'll see in some later examples. Again, we have this barrel mound or platform mound turned basically into stone. And it's likely these are suggesting that the sustenance mountain that I've talked about previously, you have a temple on top of the platform mound, like a stone temple platform with stairs going up to it. At the bottom you see stela. These are monuments of stone that have carving in them. All right, Pakal's bust. And so during the period of classic Maya art, which is this period of when Pakal was a ruler, Maya artists would work with stucco. It's kind of like plaster-based material, which they would mold into realistic, but also idealized, sort of made to look more like a ideal or perfect version of the person. Portrait busts, as in this case. This is actually not probably a true bust. It only depicts the head, but often bust includes the shoulders. But a portrait head of Pakal. And so you get this image of him as like an older man. He lived to be very old as a ruler. And we sort of look at it here, we see a little bit more the idealized nose that they thought was a marker of beauty, both men and women. Very elongated as well, not just the shape, but it's also very long. And the headdress suggests corn. One of the main Maya deities is the corn god. We see he's depicted in art sometimes and referenced in mythology a good bit in the stories from the Popol Vuh. And there are people who live on corn for the most part. So the connection between a ruler and the growing of the corn is just something, even the symbolism of his headdress is there. It's probably one of the most famous Maya sculptures, the Pakal head. It's a good one to remember. This is the actual death mask of jade. So, kind of a different thing. We see death masks like this in the barrels of the Aztecs as well. Possibly a Tehuacan as well. Jade was prized for the green. The green suggested life. It's the greening up in the spring, green of evergreen trees, that kind of thing. Green suggested life. And so, idea of coating the barrel of the dead person in green is kind of suggesting their new life. You also look at the jade jewelry and jade objects in his hand, rings, and so on. Maya people were fascinated with mirrors, which for them were made out of obsidian that was polished. And mirror bearers were a type of figure at a court who carried a mirror that was said to have a kind of spiritual potential. They thought that kind of flashing light off the mirror had some kind of spiritual significance. So this is a mirror bearer, a man holding a mirror. This is another super famous Maya sculpture, Lady Shock doing self-sacrifice. So looking at this relief, it's pretty high relief first off. You see how deep the carving is in. You can see that cast shadow coming off down into the lower part of it. So a lot of carving of a wave stone to create this image. You have an attendant or priest who has a, torch. And the Lady Shock is kneeling down, and she has her tongue out in her mouth. She's wearing a headdress and some type of cloak or mantle, and she is passing through a hole in her tongue a piece of cord that has thorns on it. So here's the detail. And so this would be a particularly kind of arduous type of self-sacrifice, very painful, you would think. Not just the size of the rope that's passing through your tongue, but those thorns. Those are from a certain kind of plant locally. So, okay, so what do you say about this? Well, one thing to note while you're taking that in is the nose of Lady Shock is, again, that idealized Maya type. I thought it was beautiful. Okay, to get back to the sacrifice issue. It was thought to be an elite responsibility to sacrifice your own blood. They're hierarchical and believe the blood of rulers was of a high-end blood, better than the commoner's blood for the gods. And so, good rulers were taught and expected to sacrifice their own blood. So something like this, kind of what she was socialized into doing, part of her status. So she likely wants to do it. It's kind of a display of her significance and power before the gods. But what about the kind of masochistic aspect of it? The pain that you're inflicting on yourself as part of this religion. In religious studies, masochism is not unheard of in world religions. Extreme fasting, extreme hardships of various kinds, done for God's sake or for the God's sake, are common in Christian history. How many stories of saints involve some pretty severe deprivations, some pretty severe suffering as part of their spiritual quest. And so that's what I think of when I look at this. Is it's like this is their kind of equivalent to those old world, examples of people pursuing their spiritual quest with a lot of hardship, self-inflicted on it. We can see her status in this as well, and that she's just decked out in perhaps jade or shell jewelry. Very fancy compared to, the average Maya woman who likely had, not much jewelry, as well as her headdress too, which of course stand out. Okay, Calakmul. Calakmul is nearly forgotten. We can see even in this modern photo, it's kind of way out there. But the cool thing with Calakmul is it has murals. First off, I just love seeing these buildings in the jungle. It's just fascinating to me. It's, it makes you think of, what's the future of America, right? I mean, I think in the long term, the forest is likely always going to win out. But anyway, let's go and look at the famous artwork from Calakmul. Calakmul has some of your standard Maya art, like stelas depicting kings. Here, Lord Yuknuntuk Kawil. So, this depicts the ruler. A big theme of Maya art is that power and significance of rulers. So we have various stela types. I'm trying to get to my mural imagery right here at Calakmul. So this is what Calakmul is known for, the murals, which are the only surviving types of art in Maya muralism, painting on walls, that depict common people. They're what we would call genre scenes in art history. There's just scenes of daily life at the town market. And I love these paintings. I mean, they show something you can see in many developing countries today, or countries in the global south, where public markets are more part of life. You have various vendors who are selling things like tamales and perhaps cacao drink. And so here we have a person who's eating tamales and a woman who is selling tamales. The way we know what's depicted are the glyphs and also just somewhat how the bottom symbols are glyphs. I don't read Maya glyphs, but to my understanding, it says like, tamale seller. So you have this really clear depiction of something people would have recognized in their daily life. Very different than a lot of Maya art, which is all about sort of religion and sort of rulers. The corn drink atole here is being prepared and drunk by a man in the market. So that's kind of a cool thing. Atole is still a common drink in Mexico, Central America. The kind of class system of the Maya, right? You've got a woman who's more fancily dressed and is depicted larger. Common in pre-modern art to depict people larger if they're of higher social significance. And she has a servant who is carrying water for her in a kind of olla, like jar thing, water bottle. Interesting pose for doing that too. This shows how they would kneel down to get it on their head. one thing we take for so much for granted nowadays in the United States is salt, because so many pre-modern people, procuring salt was a constant economic need. In fact, even in early American history, I know in my home state of Ohio, in my dad's people's state of Kentucky, in those kind of early kind of frontier states, the government, state government, it just used eminent domain to take over the salt springs, the places you could get salt in order to secure the salt supply for people in the new territory. Just an example of how for people in a pre-refrigeration, pre-modern food economy environment, salt was necessary to preserve foods and for the health. People need a certain amount of sodium in their diet, so salt here being bought and sold. I love how the bodies are actually depicted in this art. It's kind of different, not just the subject matter, but the way the style is. It's more curvilinear. It's more organic looking than some of the other Maya work, where the body is kind of underemphasized, and there's more focus on regalia. These look like just regular Maya folk. All right, cacao cups are a major Maya type of art. They depict paintings and glyphs on cups that were used for drinking cacao for lords and other men at the court, women at the court. And so they depict scenes of court life, basically. This would be like a Maya lord or someone else at the court who's seated, being attended by various servants. Beneath him, he has tamales covered in mole. He has a cacao cup to the right, the black object with some lighter orange out of it. Preparing cacao for drinking involves pouring it back and forth traditionally to make it frothy and bubbly, and that's how they would drink it. So it's got this kind of froth or bubbling coming out of it. That's how it's shown in the art. But these type of objects are found in many museum collections depicting Maya art, very common type of object. They're really famous, very vigorous style of line drawing that underlies this. Very curvilinear, a lot of sense of energy to these lines. Almost like reminiscent of 20th century illustration or comics or something. But they depict the life of the court in this case. Usually scenes oriented to the fact whoever's owning this cup was a lord or an aristocrat at court. Okay, image of the corn god, who is shown in Maya art as a young man, kind of a young, handsome, youthful man. Many Maya gods are kind of scary, or at least inhuman, like Quetzalcoatl. But the corn god is depicted as a human, likable young man, attractive. He was seen as a benevolent or auspicious figure. So a lot of positive portrayals of the corn god in my art. This shows him inside of a ear of corn. There's another picture of sculpture of the corn god as a young man. I believe this is a dancing pose. I mean, all these cultures, dance was a really important part of them. Ceremonially and for fun. The finest of the mural paintings depicting court life and ceremony are those of Bonampak in Chiapas, Mexico. The imagery I'm showing you here is actually a recreation that was made. It's a copy using modern materials because some of the original murals, unfortunately, have degraded somewhat over time. So this gives you a little sense of the rich colors that were used at Bonampak. The red, I believe, is a insect-based red. I'm forgetting the name of that insect, but it was used by European paint manufacturers, modern paint manufacturers, for a color called alizarin crimson. That used to be a standard artist color. But for a long time, centuries, red was made from these insects in Central America. Probably some of you guys have heard of this before, but that's likely the red being used. The blue is Maya blue, it's called. It's a type of synthetic blue that was created by the Maya. Because I mentioned this in my other classes. I know actually you guys haven't had them, but in Maya or in world art history, blue paint was rare. There just aren't a lot of natural blue pigments. In the old world, the most common type was blue from Afghanistan, called lapis lazuli. But since it comes from Afghanistan, to get all the way to Egypt, North Africa, Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, it's in the Near East. It was a long trip and it was very expensive. So people were always trying to figure out a different kind of blue. The Egyptians actually did. They came up with a kind of copper-based blue that's called Egyptian blue. It's likewise a synthetic blue pigment. I believe it was the earliest blue synthetic pigment, perhaps the earliest synthetic pigment, Egyptian blue. But it's the same kind of thing happening here, this kind of problem solving, how you come up with blue paint. And theirs was likewise a copper-based. You don't have a lot of options for blue paint unless you have a rock like lapis lazuli, which they didn't. So copper is the common source of blue. Other than that, these colors are basically your standard earth colors. All around the world, you got, what in modern paint is called ochre and umber and sienna paints. They're largely browns and yellows and red browns, all made from iron oxide containing soils. And those names, umber, sienna, and ochre, are linked to parts of Italy where they were sourced in the early modern period, and when those names became used for paint manufacturers. But they're the exact same colors you'll find in world art from all over, because those sort of soils are found all over the planet, including in Georgia, where we're surrounded by red, reddish brown, burnt sienna-like iron oxide soil, from which someone might be able to make a kind of burnt sienna paint or red brown paint. Blacks, of course, are made from charcoal. And whites, a few different materials. Most common historically was lead white. I think there are some clays you can use to make white paint, which they may have used actually, the Maya. I'd actually be kind of curious about that. So actually, I'm reminding myself in my slide here, I'm thinking of clay. I actually think of Maya blue, which was made from indigo. I totally forgot about indigo plant, which is native to the to Mesoamerica, and then a special clay. Combined, they can make a stable blue pigment. And I say stable because there's a lot of colorful materials around, but they fade when they're exposed to light. And so the challenge with paint making and discovering pigments is always finding colors that will actually last if they're exposed to light. Unfortunately, in art history, a lot of paints that people used turned out not to be light fast in hundreds of years down the road. So I say themes of courtly celebration. It's basically the life of the court, the life of the Maya lords. You've got musicians, you've got the lords sitting there, you've got women decked out in their finery. You have actually war scenes in this case. We'll get to those in a second. Here we can see musicians. They got trumpet-like instruments and other instruments. I would love to actually hear the sounds. It's too bad we don't have recordings. You can see all the finery that the men are wearing. There's a lot of ceremonial regalia being shown. I believe these are rattles. I could be wrong. I'm not a true expert on Maya. I wish one of my old professors is a woman named Esther Pastori, who is an expert on Maya art, and she wrote, I think, the first book on Teotihuacan, which is not Maya, but it's a neighboring people. But she had done research in the Maya as well. But basically, these are Maya ceremonial instruments. And these are, of course, the modern recreations. You can see the ones on the right have some deterioration issues. Very common for older art, especially in their area where it's so humid. Humidity is generally the enemy of art. So you want a kind of somewhat dry environment for art to last. Masking, important part of basically all the indigenous American societies. You can see glyphs included with the pictures, like the writing up in the top. It's reminiscent, perhaps, if you're familiar with Egyptian hieroglyphics, the same kind of combination of words and pictures. So here are some lords decked out in their finery. Oftentimes will have jaguar skin. Don't see any in this particular detail, but you can get a sense of how their bodies are sort of shown as sort of strong, sort of stocky, and with this elaborate regalia on. Consider that the average Maya person was walking around, at least a Maya man was walking around in a breechcloth and maybe sandals, oftentimes barefoot in the pre-modern world. And so people generally weren't wearing a lot of clothes, so this kind of thing really stood out. I mean, even Maya women would sometimes have their breasts exposed. That was not uncommon in the Americas traditionally. It wasn't as sexualized. I think in a world where sex wasn't as restricted generally, first off, and then another one where sex or where breasts had a strong breastfeeding connotation. So people were almost a little bit more used to seeing exposed breasts in that breastfeeding context. Anyway, so these are elaborate displays of lordly luxury and status and power. Remember, Maya society is born in hereditary classes. Right? To be a lord, you're born into it. It's not something you just work your way up. And so it's totally different than like North America, where generally, prior to Mississippian times anyway, I mean, you don't have anything like that. There's no sign of hereditary inequality. Definitely inequality but by achievement or what's the word in anthropology? But basically they achieved their status. They did something to make people think they're a leader. They had some kind of authority via accomplishments. But with the Maya, it's very much a aristocracy. They're born into it. They're nobles. They're lords, and very much about displaying that status. Battle scene is not something you see painted in Maya art a lot, but it's cool to see it depicted. These are very common in world art. Many paintings around the world of battles, but to see one in Maya is rare. And we see their approach as really kind of focusing on hand-to-hand combat and this kind of exploits of individual warriors. It was really a chaotic scene too. Hard to decipher exactly who is who, and it's definitely interesting. It has glyphs, so if you could read the glyphs, I'm sure telling you what's going on. And then the captives. So, when you have human sacrifice with the Maya and Aztec, they're generally sacrificing war captives. It's not their own people they're sacrificing. Generally, it's captives of war. So, here we go. And then, the way these captives would be sacrificed would be on the temple pyramid platforms, and then sometimes actually rolled down the steps. I see suggested here. The captives have been stripped of all their clothing too. You see most of them are naked or nearly so. And the message here is very much about the power of the lords, right? I mean, they are depicted wearing jaguar skins, the kind of apex predator of their area. and with the power of life and death over the captives. Sacrifice, bloodletting of the king or lord. Okay. So that's just a little taste of Maya art. There's a lot more to get into with them, but it gives you a sense of the kind of subject matter and themes and just sort of style of their work. And if you want to go further, that's a great topic to explore. Teotihuacan is not as well known in the United States as Maya. I think most people have heard of Maya people. Teotihuacan is really a pretty fascinating place. I mentioned my old professor, Professor Esther Pastore, who wrote a book on Teotihuacan called Teotihuacan, An Experiment in Living. An Experiment in Living. It's unlike the other societies. It was a multi-ethnic, multicultural city-state. And the gods are different at Teotihuacan. It seems like the main god was a kind of mother goddess associated with rain. So this is a little bit different. Also, many people at Teotihuacan were not farmers or hunters. They were craftsmen. And Teotihuacan worked, people lived actually in these apartment complexes where they worked often in the same buildings as where they lived, with other people who all did the same kind of craft. And they would export out crafts they made to the to the surrounding countryside, including to the Maya countryside, but also north. So definitely interesting, different kind of development. Experiment in Living suggests people may have Pastore's title suggests almost that, it suggests how people probably moved here deliberately because they wanted a different lifestyle where they were seeking opportunity that wasn't available in their village they lived in. Okay, so here we have the Temple of Sun and Moon, these really big pyramid platform mounds that are clad in stone, and they're laid out major road between them or causeway between them, and then surrounding smaller temple buildings. It's believed they have an orientation toward a mountain on the horizon too. Some of that can be a little bit uncertain, but likely they're lined up with the mountain or with or with astronomical alignments. Something we saw with the Hopewell in North America as well. Colossal in scale, huge. The name Teotihuacan comes from the Aztecs, and it is the place where the gods were born, the place of the gods. They thought Teotihuacan was amazing and tried to bring its influence into the Aztec polity. It's kind of interesting because, Aztec people, their art is better in some ways. But they really admired Teotihuacan. So here is the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent. You have images of a snake combined with feathers that are references to Tlaloc or Quetzalcoatl, not Tlaloc, but are references to Quetzalcoatl or the feathered serpent, but they're right next to images of Tlaloc, which we will see, the rain god. And so this pairing of these two recognizable Mesoamerican deities. On the left you have the feathered serpent, sometimes also shown with the head with some jaguar features. So it's got snake scales, kind of a jaguar-like face, and then feathers coming out around it. So it's a Quetzalcoatl image. And then on the right, you have this we call it goggle head deity, where you have these like round eyes like that, almost like abstract. Those kind of eyes on a rain god have been found in Mesoamerican art going back way way back in like early Maya times, I believe maybe Olmec depictions. Basically, it's an older imagery of a rain god, distinguished with those goggle eyes, the two little eyes. Almost seems like a video game character or something. But that's the rain god. So these two important gods are depicted on this temple in these reliefs, high reliefs that are carved around. And you have this famous mural that is a depiction of what we believe is a kind of goddess with rain imagery coming out from her, like as if growing out from like a tree-like form with drops of water coming off of it. And then to the sides of her are gods or goddesses who are watering plants, and there are plants growing up out of the ground that appear to be corn. So it's some kind of agricultural deity, which, is different than some of the other gods in Mesoamerica. This is unique to Teotihuacan. There isn't any like great goddess type image of a goddess elsewhere. So it seems like they developed their own religious expression at Teotihuacan, just as the city itself was multi-ethnic and had this kind of interesting density and people living close together, and devotion more to craft work than farming, which makes it different than the other Mesoamerican societies. All right, so great goddess, very famous. You can look into a lot of the debates on the great goddess and whether that was the primary deity. There's a lot of debate about exactly the role of the great goddess in Teotihuacan. I know it's going kind of long, so kind of moving along here. So Aztec, out of any of these, you're probably most familiar with Aztec. They were around when the Spanish showed up, so we have a lot of writing about the Aztec. Numerous Aztec descendants became, technically they became Spanish nobles. Curiosity of colonialism. But a number of them, learned Spanish or actually wrote in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, about their culture and lifeways. And so you can read about their folk traditions and kind of how people lived and everything. And so it's a lot easier to study than the others. The Aztec were people from the north, and they believed they're from the north. That was their story. And that they traveled to central Mexico and stopped at a place where they had been told by their patron deity that a eagle would appear on a cactus. And that was the location of where Mexico City is today, or their capital, Tenochtitlan. It's an island they created in a large lake, Texcoco. It was a unique city for the Americas. It's the only one that I know of that was built based around canals, more like Venice or some other global cities that were canal-based cities. So people would travel around on small boats and small canoes, and they developed a cool system of farming based on reclaiming soil from either the banks of the lake or from like the rich soil down underneath the water, underneath the lake. And they created these artificial islands that you can farm, and some of them still exist. I actually have a picture here coming up. Scholars think that Aztecs are Mexica, same people, right? Mexica is probably a better name for them, although, I've been calling them Aztec a long time, so it kind of sticks. But they probably came as mercenaries. There were already hundreds of thousands of people living in central Mexico, and they already had city-states, not just Teotihuacan, but many smaller ones. The Mexica own self-image was that they were barbarians, They weren't civilized people, but they learned civilization when they came to central Mexico. Their patron god was a god of war, as would befit people who were mercenaries. Huitzilopochtli, who they identified with the sun, somehow linked to the sun. The Aztecs were, kind of brutal. They had expansionist tendencies. They fought their neighbors, and were in a kind of permanent war footing with a group of people called Tlaxcalans, who eventually were the major force who worked with the Spanish to eventually overthrow the Aztecs. So, kind of live by the sword, die by the sword thing as far as the Tlaxcalans were concerned. All right, Lake Texcoco, huge, right, with this artificial island created. I think it was actually built out of an already existing island, but it's expanded with some smaller man-made islands and big causeways built. Very unique city, as you can see. The famous Spanish conquistador wrote that it seemed almost like a dream, the city, because of just how odd it was, so grand. One thing, I'm not getting into the Spanish here, that's a whole other story, but the thing with the conquistadors that's worth knowing is that they were like rough guys who were from a poor country in a poor part of the world. Spain to this day is a kind of poor country, very high unemployment, some pretty severe economic issues. And it was even more so in the time of they were setting off to make a fortune in the New World. And, that harshness from poverty and the history of their Iberian Peninsula kind of comes across if you read any of their accounts. I mean, like I mentioned, I think in the last lecture on De Soto, that, you read it and it's like, and then we just took the queen captive and we're going to kill her, but we decided we'd keep her. And it's like, wow, it's just kind of a brutal mentality to have. Like, I'll just take him captive, kill him. That's pretty much De Soto, right? It's like he's invited in here not De Soto, but Cortez. He's invited in by Montezuma, like the Aztec king or emperor, to talk, basically. And so they just respond, they go in and just take him captive. I mean, it's right. It's just they're brutal people. Like the old cliche of the Spanish are the real barbarians. It's like, certainly the conquistadores were. I think that if they were alive and you said that to them, they would agree. I mean, they weren't trying to be nice guys. So the artificial islands used for farming are the chinampas, they're called. So I love this photo because it just shows ordinary farmer growing stuff, navigating by canoe. It's just a fascinating kind of type of farming, right adjacent to a large city. So the Spanish were big on destroying, as you're aware, destroying religious buildings. And what they would do in Latin America is called superimposition, which is a term that means basically tear down the old religious building and put a church on it, which is exactly what was done in Latin America. A lot of times the big church was built where an old indigenous religious building had been. And so that's the kind of how things worked. But this is a reconstruction of the old sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan. The Temple Mayor is like the biggest temple where sacrifices were done, even at the time the Spanish were there and wrote about it. At the bottom of the Temple Mayor, in modern times we found this as a calendar stone that was referenced, I believe actually was referenced in writing by one of the Spanish chroniclers. But it depicts a sun in the middle and 4 squares around it that contain images referencing Aztec concept of history. You may have heard of this before. I think it comes up in pop culture sometimes. But basically Aztecs believed that there had been different ages before the modern age. They called those ages the suns. And so each age was referred to as a sun. There were 4 previous ones. Each previous age had been destroyed, had been resulted in destruction. Right. I'm forgetting all my Aztec destruction methods, but a lot of them were really gruesome and painful. Right. The twist is they believe our sun, the 5th sun, the one we're in now, or at least in their time, they believed that it was going to be destroyed eventually. There was going to be another big cataclysm, basically. That's a real twist on Mesoamerican timekeeping, because nowhere else. I mean, people will sometimes say the Maya believed in this, but that's not true. With the Maya conception of the time, like the 5,000 odd years, it doesn't end. It just resets. I mean, it's just like it's like as if you thought your clock was gonna stop working if it hit midnight or whatever. It's like, well, no, it just starts over again. I mean, it doesn't end. I mean, but for the Aztec one, it's more of a linear, almost apocalyptic conception of time, where our days are winding down and the world is basically running out of energy in a sense, and there's going to be this big cataclysmic end with earthquakes. And the only way to stop that temporarily was by sacrifice, our own blood as well as the blood of our enemies. And so sacrifices were made at the Temple Mayor, and this stone there below was depicted, or was located below the temple, and gave sort of a cosmic justification for these gruesome displays of violence that were part of the Aztec system of power, system of religion and politics. The Temple Mayor also has the Coyolxauhqui stone, which depicts a goddess who's been dismembered and killed, of course, by the Aztecs' patron god Huitzilopochtli, a god of war. Remember, they may have been mercenaries before, so they have this kind of military ruthlessness in the background. And their god is a god who, in the story, I've got my little slide here in a second. It's the story of Huitzilopochtli's birth and how he ultimately respects his mother by defending her against a sister of his who insulted her honor. So basically, Coatlicue is Huitzilopochtli and Coyolxauhqui's mother, and she becomes miraculously pregnant without a man. No man involved. But her daughter says, I don't believe that. And according to the story, attacks her. What are you fooling around with this man out of wedlock or whatever? And Huitzilopochtli is born in this instant and responds immediately by killing his sister in order to defend his mother. And he cuts off her head, dismembers her, and throws her off the body, or off the mountain where she's just all broken apart down at the bottom. This story was recalled by those Aztec priests who did the sacrifices. So what was going on in those famous sacrifices was they were acting in the place of Huitzilopochtli in the myth or in the story. It's like a lot of ceremonies around the world involve this mythic recreation of the past. And their mythic recreation was this action, a heroic action, in their concept by Huitzilopochtli, their patron god. It also feminizes their enemies. It's a little subtle aspect of this. They are emasculating their enemies by associating them with this female, rebellious female who's brutally killed and dishonorably dismembered. So, have immense beauty in Mesoamerica, and certainly with the Aztecs, you get this pretty dramatic, apocalyptic, gruesome spectacle as part of the society. It's just such a fascinating and really unique kind of combination of sensibilities. On the one hand, these people have immense appreciation of beauty, of knowledge. They wrote poetry, philosophy. I mean, it's beyond the scope of this class. They were interested in nature, interested in farming. The Spanish accounts of Montezuma and the court, they were deeply impressed with them, thought they were sophisticated and, highly mannered, and the environment they lived in was very nice and clean, and it was a very pleasant place. And the Spanish were like, ruthless barbarians. They're like, go in there and just take him captive, kill him, if he doesn't cooperate. It's really striking. And I laugh. I don't mean to make light of it, but it's just I've studied this a lot of years, and it just continually shocks me. It's just striking. It's just striking about how that worked. Very different than something I could see myself doing. But at the same time, all that sophistication, you've got this really gruesome display of, violence and ideology and state power. But as I always tell students who are shocked by the Aztecs, look at the European cities at the time. Gruesome displays were common. Because, think of all the public means of execution. It wasn't like, lethal injection nowadays, right? It was horrible forms of torture, which I can show you depicted in art if you're interested in it. But they include things like, being drawn and quartered or stretched and broken on the wheel, and, things like being hung up from a pole by your hands. And so you just have to hang up there until your shoulders dislocate, and eventually you're just become detached from your body, and then eventually you just be killed. There were a lot of gruesome, terrible spectacles of violence that people turned out and watched and just took for granted as part of the society, And so it's not the same as the gruesome sacrifice, but bottom line is a lot of societies out there have some pretty gruesome displays of violence, and I think that maybe it may be a little bit of it's easy to see it in the Aztecs, but it's a little harder to see it in your own culture that's been kind of sanitized a little bit in how it's been presented. So Aztecs had scribes, and they wrote large numbers of books called codices that are like sewn together pages of folded parchment. Unfortunately, the Spanish considered it important to burn books. They considered whatever they had written in there, they couldn't read it. It was written in glyphs. That whatever that was must have been the devil's knowledge. And so they did burn a lot of them. And it's true, some of those likely contained, religious this and that. But almost certainly a lot of it was history, a lot of it was natural knowledge of nature, poetry for sure. We know there's some of that survives and has been republished. So a lot of knowledge was lost by the Spanish kind of foolishness. Some codices still survive, though. Codex Borgia is one of them. The Florentine Codex is another big one that deals with some Aztec history. But just giving you a sense of what these look like. It's kind of a mixture of writing and pictures. All right, and to end, I alluded to this in the North American, but throughout the Americas, this period of history really ends via the during the period of the Great Dying, as it's called in history, where Old World diseases spread through the New World, from the Caribbean, South America, Central America, all the way into North America, the Southeast, so on and so forth. And these so-called virgin earth epidemics could kill 90% of the people immediately. Right. It's not like drawn out over hundreds of years. We're talking about like fast when the diseases first come. And so the population loss in central Mexico, where there was a history of population keeping because of the Aztecs, was a drop of about 90% in the 1500s. So huge loss of human life, probably unlike anything else in human history. And people died of all, you're familiar with it, I know, but the diseases that killed people were influenza, smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, chickenpox, lots of old world diseases. I'm forgetting some. Smallpox was huge. Tuberculosis was one of them. Influenza was, flu is obviously common in old world, but particularly in Europe and Eurasia. Flu, to my understanding, is a cold weather disease. I don't think flu is very common in Africa. Traditionally, some of you guys may know if you're from Africa, and that's your heritage. But I believe flu is mainly, flu is mainly a cold weather thing. So that was a big killer. Even though in the old world where flu was found, it didn't really kill that many people. Even in modern times, there was a case recorded in the mid 1900s of Christian missionaries going to the Amazon rainforest, to a remote section where people generally didn't interact much in person with the outside world. And to deal with that, you hear the uncontacted tribes. Well, those uncontacted tribes are remnants of people who decided their way of dealing with the Spanish and Portuguese in modern Brazilian state was to just get away from them and try to move farther into the woods, into the forest. And so they aren't just like people who have like no idea that like history ever happened or something. They're people who are trying to get away from colonialism. And granted, their ancestors may have headed out there hundreds of years ago now, but they're almost like, they're not like maroon communities because they weren't slaves, but they kind of have that. If you're familiar with maroon communities in the Caribbean, it's like, slaves who escaped or freed themselves and set up independent communities far away, like in remote parts of the land. You have some of that in the history of the American South as well, particularly in the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia, where slaves would escape to and had their own communities that were far out into the swamp. Anyway, the Brazilian case, let's get back to this topic at hand. You have these uncontacted tribes or distant tribes out there, and the Christian missionaries are going. They brought their kid with them. It was like, 8-year-old or something. Kid had chickenpox, and they didn't know it until they got down there. But chickenpox spread in that tribe and killed a huge number of people. So that's just an example of, what these diseases were like. I've been teaching this since I was 22, about 18 years. And, it used to be, I'm like, it'd be hard to imagine living through anything like that. But as we have dealt with coronavirus, we have a little small taste of what new viruses in an area and a population can be like and how disruptive they can be. Let alone these diseases where 90% of the people were dying. Okay, so that'll do it for Mesoamerica. I'll see you on the discussion board.